The oldest and one of the most frequently visited tourist destinations in the United States is Yellowstone National Park. Guests from all over the world visit the park because of its magnificent looks and because it allows them to connect with nature in a unique way. It's home to over 10,000 hydrothermal sites, which, as hot springs or geysers, make up more than half of the active geysers that you can find anywhere in the world. It has over 290 waterfalls and 1,000 miles of hiking trails. But some Yellowstone National Park officials just announced a chilling discovery that was made within the park. What could it be? Join us as we give you the full story. Yellowstone is such a beautiful and fun site to visit, and some of its main attractions include Old Faithful, a legendary geyser which shoots towering bursts of steaming water more than a dozen times a day. The wild Lamar Valley also features the largest concentration of mammals, such as bears, wolves, coyotes, moose, and bison. For some, a visit to the park is a once-in-a-lifetime trip, so they go to great lengths in planning to have the experience. In 2021, the park hit a historic visit, hosting over 4.9 million visitors in Yellowstone. Despite all of the attractions that make the park appealing, it doesn't come without certain risks and hazards. A handful of events have led some visitors to the hospital after sustaining various degrees of injury, while others have vanished at some of the destinations within the park. Many of these accidents result from breaking the rules, either by approaching wildlife or walking on a hot spring. And some of these stories have even made headlines. One such case was that of Colin Scott, a psychology graduate who was traveling with his sister through a prohibited area of the Yellowstone National Park in 2016. They wanted to engage in hot potting, and in case you don't know what hot potting is, it's an illegal practice where you swim in one of the park's thermal pools. Many places within the park do bear signs that state the rules that could help visitors to have a hitch-free experience. Rather than maintain the prescribed boardwalk route covering the thermal areas within the Norris Geyser Basin at the park, they opted to deviate from the rules and the route. And unfortunately for Colin, he slipped and fell into a boiling acidic hot spring while attempting to examine the spring's temperature and did not make it out. All efforts by his sister who was filming the whole adventure to rescue him would prove to be futile. Even rescuers who got there could not recover the subject's body due to the volatile thermal area and an approaching lightning storm. However, they did find his head, upper torso, and hands. And by the time that officials had returned to the spring the next morning, the acidic pool had completely dissolved Colin's body. Since 1890 up until this date, there have been at least 20 such deaths. But why do people still visit the park with the full knowledge of the dangers of the hot springs within? Although the hot springs in Yellowstone are dangerous, they're very safe to visit as long as you obey the posted signs and exercise extreme caution, especially around the thermal features. It's one of the reasons that pets are not allowed in the location. At other times, the park has had its fair share of natural disasters, which range from floods to earthquakes. A recent event occurred on June the 13th of 2022 when high water levels in the Gardner River eroded the park's north entrance road. The water levels were due to heavy flooding, rock slides, and extremely hazardous conditions near Gardner, Montana. This insane flooding would cause serious damage to the road along with power outages, and this event made the officials close the park to incoming visitors for at least 2 days, with an evacuation process in place. The forecasts would call for even more rainfall within those periods, with the Yellowstone River already at record levels. Susan Weber and her husband Stephen were some of the unlucky visitors to the park who were having a great time when the rains began. The couple, together with their son and daughter-in-law and their 2 grandchildren, got stuck just outside of the national park, and they couldn't leave the area due to road closures. They explained how they had seen a house collapse into the Yellowstone River and a shed-like structure slide into the water until it vanished. Such a natural disaster has led park officials to shut down the park for some time. Despite these occurrences, the 150-year-old park continued to bounce back as each season welcomes different visitors. And each time the park reopens, you'll see hundreds of cars backed up in long lines, indicating that even though some tragic events have unfolded at times within the park, it still doesn't stop people from visiting in droves each year. Another major event that's peculiar to the park is a supervolcano. A supervolcano is the largest class of volcanic eruption, during which over 1,000 cubic kilometers of material ash and debris is ejected. The plumes from such an eruption can rise 17 to 30 miles into the atmosphere, and according to one study, such a super eruption can shut down electronic communications and air travel throughout the continent and also alter the climate. There is a giant underground reservoir of hot magma at the park 5 miles deep. A gigantic plume of molten rock feeds the reservoir. That heat is responsible for many of the park's famous geysers and hot springs. As magma rises into the chamber and cools down, the ground above also practically rises and falls. And some have asked about the supervolcano underneath of Yellowstone having another massive eruption, but there's no need to worry. The odds of that occurring are extremely low. Despite being thousands of times more powerful than any regular volcano, the Yellowstone supervolcano has only had 3 historical huge eruptions. The first one is said to have occurred about 2.1 million years ago, the second and third around 1.3 million and 640,000 years ago respectively, the most recent having occurred 70,000 years ago at Pitchstone Plateau. Irrespective of what you may hear in the news about the possibility of another super eruption, there's no indication of a recurrence, especially of an eruption of that size. Despite knowing this, the apocalyptic nature of the Yellowstone supervolcano remains a source of fascination to many visitors. In other words, Yellowstone gets so much attention because of the catastrophic nature of its supervolcanoes. But what could be more catastrophic than a supervolcano that's capable of burying the entire state of Texas 5 feet deep? Officials from Yellowstone National Park have issued a warning following a discovery in a study by some scientists. Larry Maston, a United States Geological Survey hydrologist, and Jacob Lowenstern, the scientist in charge of the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory in Menlo Park, California, produced a paper in 2016 on the ashfall impacts of a probable super eruption using the hypothetical Yellowstone super eruption as a case study. The objective was to see how the growth of the umbrella clouds would affect ash distribution from Yellowstone. What the 2 scientists discovered was shocking. Usually, when we have a super eruption, the major damage would be from volcanic ash, a combination of splintered rock and glass. It's usually ejected miles into the air and then scattered around the country. A super eruption could bury the northern Rockies in 3 feet of ash and kill people, plants, and animals, and at the same time, the distribution would depend on conditions such as the time of the year and the weather patterns. To understand how the ash from a Yellowstone super eruption would spread, they used a model known as Ash 3D. The model incorporated data on historical wind patterns to calculate the possible ash thickness for the super eruption at the park 640,000 years ago. It was discovered that cities within 500 kilometers of the modeled super eruption could be covered by centimeters to more than a meter of ash. These cities would include Billings, Montana, Casper, Wyoming, and many more. The ash could just be centimeters in the upper Midwestern cities such as Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Des Moines, Iowa, and in contrast, cities on the east and Gulf coasts like New York and Washington, D.C. would only receive millimeters of accumulation or less. California cities would get millimeters to centimeters of ash, while Pacific Northwest cities such as Portland, Oregon, Seattle, Washington would get up to a few centimeters. Irrespective of the quantity of the accumulations, whether small or large, ash distribution could cause some serious havoc around the country. For instance, it could damage buildings, block sewer and water lines, and even cause respiratory issues, short out electrical transformers, reduce road traction, and disrupt livestock and crop production. The study also reported that even smaller eruptions could generate a distinctive ash cloud known as an umbrella. Only the spreading umbrella cloud from a super eruption deposits ash in a pattern that concentrates it in the center and is less affected by prevailing winds. This eruption makes its own winds and can overcome the prevailing westerly winds that blow in from the west. Also, the expansion rate of the leading edge of ash cloud during a large volcanic eruption could exceed the average calm wind speed for hours or even days, depending on how long the eruption is. This expansion could drive ash more than 1,500 kilometers, or 932 miles upwind, westward, crosswinds, and north to the south. This way, it produces a pattern that's centered on the eruption site. The past 3 largest eruptions at Yellowstone have drove ash over tens of thousands of square miles, as ash deposits from the eruptions were found all throughout the central and western United States and Canada. In addition, a huge eruption like any of the 3 could impact the global climate. Usually, volcanoes emit sulfur aerosols that direct sunlight back into the atmosphere to cool the climate, and since these particles only lived a short moment in the atmosphere, their effect is also temporal. However, it can be dramatic. One instance was the Tambora eruption of 1815, which cooled the planet to the extent that crops worldwide were damaged, leading to famines in some areas. If such a relatively small eruption could cause damage of that kind, just think of the damages that a supervolcano could cause. However, the odds of a possible Yellowstone eruption are extremely low. In the past, scientists could not accurately estimate ash distribution from these deposits, and this is partly due to erosion and also because there was no way that they could determine how the ash is transported. However, with a new model, scientists can get a better view of the ash distribution from super eruptions of the past at the park and where considerable amounts of ash reach the west coast. One of the most frequently asked questions about natural hazards at the park is whether it's possible to drill into Yellowstone to stop it from erupting. USGS ruled out one such idea because of the high costs and the environmental impacts of such drilling. Besides these, drilling through hot and mushy rock is likely to have little effect on the magma that's stored beneath Yellowstone. They say this is because any hole that would be drilled would become sealed by minerals crystallizing from the natural fluids that are present in the depths. Additionally, Yellowstone National Park is protected from geothermal resource development. For instance, the Old Faithful Geyser and Grand Prismatic Spring depend on the heat that's provided by the magma chamber deep below the park's surface. Any form of geothermal extraction will alter the behavior of existing geysers and hot springs, which may cause them to disappear. According to the current seismic imaging of the magma reservoir, there appears to be a system that's too crystalline to erupt on a grand scale, thus easing the concerns about the possibility of having volcanic eruptions at Yellowstone. Even if there were any significant eruptive magma beneath Yellowstone, drilling into it would only pose a devastating effect. This conclusion is based on scientific research that has proven that depressurization is one of the factors driving magma toward the surface to erupt. In other words, any attempt to cool and depressurize magma systems would have many negative consequences, which includes increasing the likelihood of an eruption. However, the odds of Yellowstone erupting anytime soon are extremely low, but that doesn't mean that the Earth will not see super eruptions in the future elsewhere. Even if there were to be another supervolcano, this hotspot would have to heat up and melt the cold crust first, which could take 1,000,000 years or more. But what do you think about the situation? Should this chilling discovery be disregarded since the park appears to be serene at the moment? Or do you feel that scientists and governments are not telling you the whole truth about the feared volcanic eruptions in Yellowstone? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section down below.